I want to welcome you all to this fifth video put on by your Northwest Ohio Association Stewardship and Caring Committee. If you've had a chance to see the previous four, then I know some of what I'm going to say is repetitive. If you haven't seen the previous four, this is our committee's desire to bring before you Don Hill. Don has been in the field of church fundraising and stewardship for years. You've seen him if you've been to some of our association annual gatherings or at the conference annual gatherings. You may also remember him from time spent in the national offices and his work now with Living Water Association. The last couple of years, we've been trying to initiate a pilot program where we could have Don work with some congregations willing to take him up on the offer to have him come in and be a consultant coach with their church. It was originally designed as a fee-based kind of structure. But it was also designed with lots of benefits, and the idea was to help with local church stewardship giving, and stewardship in its broadest frame, which is leading us to the topic of this fifth video. Mike Fauner and Fran Boardman and Adrian Sunday and myself, as chair of the committee, are here to have the interaction with Don. And Jay Scott, who's another member of the committee, who I think I failed to mention in the previous ones. He came up with the title. He took the generic information and came up with these cute little marketing, if you will, titles for us to pique people's information. And of course, there's a lot of depth behind them, which is the purpose of our videos. So our fifth and final topic in this series, and if you leave comments and you like them, we may figure out how to do more of them, or perhaps some regular Zoom sessions with Don. We just aren't sure, but we hope these are of value. So the topic for this session is plan. Who needs a plan? Setting the tone for your congregation's giving. Fran has been assigned to ask the first question. And so, Fran, go ahead and share the first question we had come up with.
Okay. Giving is about our relationship with and gratitude to God. If we preach and teach that, why do we need a plan for beyond that?
It is a question that comes up a lot. Let me go back to my own experience. I started out in fundraising in secular organizations. And so that has been my background. And what I brought to the conversation once I joined faith-based organizations, first as Director of Development at Andover Newton Theological School, was that background. You know, how do you raise money? And since that time, you know, I've engaged in the battle, it seems, in the church around the stewardship folks and the fundraising folks. And it's a battle that even after all these years continues. And the battle lines are the question that you just asked, you know, what giving has to be for people of faith, for people of Christian faith, a response to God's generosity. And that is enough. And the existence of the church is enough, or should be enough, to impel people to give. And if they don't, once we explain that to them, then there's something wrong with them, or there's something wrong with our preaching and our teaching. And the fundraising folks, on the other hand, say, you know, what we need to do is follow the best practices of engaging people around vision and impact, and that will raise money for the church. And the church needs to articulate a case beyond its own existence and beyond that theological context in order to be successful in raising money. Well, my hope is that we can get to the point where we understand that it's not either or, it's both and. That yes, we as people of faith respond to God's generosity with our own generosity. And that's a necessary, but it's not a sufficient way of looking at the task of generating dollars for the church. The reality is, in previous generations, and certainly in the early church, the church was the principal, if not the only means that God's mission on earth was being realized. And for many people in our congregations today, people who didn't grow up with a traditional understanding of the church, there are many other organizations and ways that people can be generous to and with that meet that goal of responding to God's generosity. So people will say to you, when I give to Habitat for Humanity, I'm responding to God's generosity by supporting an organization that is meeting one of the gospel imperatives. That can be hard to argue against. I've always said, though, that if you believe what we believe about the church, the case for the church will always be stronger than the case for non-church entities in terms of that support of God's mission. So how do we distinguish? And I think the way we distinguish is by starting with that understanding of generosity, but then putting on top of it, if you will, the best practices in engaging people around why the church is uniquely qualified to realize God's mission on earth. And that, as we talked about in a previous conversation here, is about articulating the gospel values in a way that is accessible to people and understandable for people. Those of you who were around for the Still Speaking initiative years ago, remember that part of the success of that was not creating a set of values that the United Church of Christ was about, but it was about articulating them in a way that was accessible to people. So that's number one. Number two is vision. I think, and I believe many people in our churches believe, especially in the United Church of Christ, that we are called not only to be generous, but to be disciples, to get stuff done, to consider the gospel imperatives and act on them. And so articulating a vision for the church that defines success for people is a way of encouraging and impelling them to give. And then a strategy for achieving that, telling the stories of transformation, is all part of that process of going beyond, I believe, just preaching and teaching generosity to a point where we also engage people in investing, if you will, in the work of the church with the expectation of ministry outcomes that are outlined for us in the texts of our faith. So that would be my answer to that question. It's sort of a long involvement, perhaps, but it has to be an understanding of generosity, but it can't just be that, both from a missional perspective in terms of how we respond to God's generosity, not just with sort of blind, here's some money, but also with an understanding that we're called to effectiveness as well as generosity. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Mike, I think you had the next follow-up question.
Yeah. Well, in order to bring all these ideas to fruition, who would be responsible? Who do you think would be responsible for putting together a plan for congregational giving?
Well, one of the things that I think is a missed opportunity is those congregations who create a stewardship committee and say, all right, go off and raise the money that we need in order to do ministry. I think, first of all, there needs to be an integration between the ministry of the church and steward, or let me put it a different way. I think stewardship needs to be understood as a ministry of the church, both to its members and beyond its membership. And that has implications for who provides leadership. Number one, I think our pastors need to be involved as preachers and teachers, and also as people who engage members of the congregation in their giving. We hit upon in our last video what could be a year-long discussion of how pastors are or are not involved in fundraising for congregations. But at the very least, our pastors need to provide leadership in a theological understanding of generosity and discipleship and the connections between the two. In addition to that, if stewardship is not integrated into the leadership structure of the church in terms of council or whatever you call it, I think there's a missed opportunity and the potential for some real problems. The culture around money of the church is often dysfunctional because it's isolated as not being the purview of missional leadership in the church. And I think that's a real mistake. So the direct answer to your question is, all of the leadership of the church has to be concerned about and engaged in the generosity and giving life of the congregation. Otherwise, number one, you're not going to raise the money that you might. And number two, I think our faithfulness in the call to stewardship is compromised.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So, Don, what do you think about, I've heard about some practical strategies. There was a book written way back, Make Meetings Matter. And then another one came out 15, 20 years later, the context of meetings as worship, trying to redefine that work that we often see as the business of the church. Mm-hmm. To say, no, when we're gathered together for a meeting of church council or consistory, that should be an act of worship. Have you seen any creative ways where that kind of thing is expressed in the same way of the act of stewardship? We talked in an earlier video about stewardship, the time, talent, treasure, the wholeness of generosity. Again, are there any ways that you've seen that are just creative that might put in people's minds, here's the thought by how you might do that, and not just have the talking head pastor do it, or the talking head pastor who's afraid to do it. Just how. So I guess I'll just leave it at that. Have you, do you have a couple juicy tidbits of here's some cute little creative way I've seen, and just think about it. It may be right for those who are listening. It may not be, but it might get them to think of a little different way to.
Well, I'm not sure if this answers your question or not, but your question provoked in me thinking about how, when I work with congregations around strategic planning, I make the distinction and encourage them to make the distinction between the missional components of their congregation, of their conversation, and the organizational components of their conversation. There is, for example, let's take evangelism as an example. There's a missional component of bringing people to relationship with Jesus Christ through their engagement with our faith communities. And then there's the organizational component of saying, we need more pledging units in order to be sustainable. Now, both of those are conversations that happen, but both conversations are compromised unless you, in the conversation, make the distinction about what you're talking about. Because to confuse the two, I think, is a mistake. And I think the same thing is true of stewardship. There's a point at which we in the church need to preach and teach stewardship, no matter what the object of that generosity is. When I was on national staff, people would often say to me, you know, a lot of secular organizations love the United Church of Christ because it's full of generous people. They just don't give to the United Church of Christ. We've been teaching and preaching generosity and stewardship for many years very effectively, but we haven't been doing the fundraising piece. So again, that missional component and that organizational component, we need to be clear about what we're doing and why we're doing particular things and where those things mesh and where they don't. Is that an answer to your question, or did I just go off on another one of my rants that have no bearing on what we're talking about?
I mean, yeah, it's an answer to the question. There's always, you know, as someone who has spent their lives going to thousands of conferences, you know, there's the macro issue and then there's the micro. How do I do this? And are there any, for instance, I think it's good to have someone sitting in a meeting who's you're gonna be the theologian tonight that always asks the question, how is what we're doing, what's that got to do with God?
That's right.
And in the same way, maybe you'd always ask the same question, you know, what is how we're doing got to do with our mission and our raising dollars for its support? And sometimes we just gloss over all those things so quickly into doing the business.
That's right.
But at the same time, if we haven't done a good job, which we talked about in a previous video, because there's a dysfunction out there, a disconnect that has really caused so many churches to get away from the whole conversation due to uncomfortableness. You know, again, are there any basics to just begin the process anew that would be really helpful, that might be part of that plan, and putting together a plan that could be helpful for people to have a take home with?
Well, I think in goal setting, people need to be aware of and transparent around these two different approaches that the church needs to have in order to be faithful and also to be sustainable. So that when that stewardship committee meets, don't just, you know, there are people on the stewardship committee who are going to be outraged if you only talk about pledging units, and there are people on the committee who will be outraged if you only talk about generosity. So talk about them both. Set goals for both of them, and work towards both of them and figure out how to make them work with each other, I guess is my encouragement. Transparency of thinking about money is really important, I think. We, you know, for a long time, we talked about stewardship when what we meant was fundraising. And it was a way of masking something that we thought was unpleasant. And, you know, I would just encourage us to be honest about what we're talking about. We are, in fact, talking about, you know, getting people to give us more money. It's not just about getting people to be more generous. That's, you know, that's hiding what our real motivation is. So I don't know if that's helpful. I don't know if that's practical enough, but I think that's an important step for us.
Okay. Well, thank you for the time. I forgot to explain at the beginning of this video that you've all noticed we're all dressed the same. And that's because we put these 5 videos together on a Saturday morning, and you're seeing the final edited product of it. But the point is that we wanted to raise some thoughtful discussion. It's not meant to be the end of all discussions, but rather hopefully beginning points. And we're hoping that as a committee, we can continue to work with Don in a variety of ways, and perhaps follow through on that pilot program that we talked about with some churches who may want more direct contact with him in the work of being a faithful disciple of Christ, and the work of around the whole conversation of being a good steward of the resources God has granted to us, and as a church as we attempt to engage in those. So please give us your feedback, and send comments through the association website, which provides the resource email for you to use. And we hope to be in further engagement with you, whether it's on Zoom or in person, as the whole pandemic works its way forward. And we're glad to have been able to invite you into our various homes and into Don's presence. I know Don always likes to do a final sharing. So before we close off, Don, do you have a final word of greeting and wisdom for us?
Well, I just want to say I love these conversations, and I love being in conversations with people who are working very hard on behalf of our United Church of Christ. This has been a pleasure, and I will do it 1,000 times more. I think there are some other people who are part of the conversation. I think it's also valuable for you to see your committee in action. It is a group of people who care deeply about your association, about the churches in it, and about the whole United Church of Christ. And I'm grateful to them for their commitment to our community and to stewardship and generosity. So thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this.
Well, thank you. And my understanding to the rest of the committee is we have 2 new people who will be joining us after the annual meeting. So we're actually growing with folks who have said they would like to be part of this endeavor. So with that in mind, be blessed and be a blessing. And again, please email us or pick up the phone, and we'll do our best to get a response to you all. Have a great day today.